Hey guys, Heidi Priebe here. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, we use this channel to talk about Myers-Briggs personality types, attachment styles, and any other systems that can help us understand ourselves and other people better, as well as how we can bridge the gap between ourselves and other people using these systems, and how we can use different tools and different vocabularies to make changes in the way that we operate and show up in the world. So today I wanted to talk about a specific vocabulary distinction that has actually gotten a lot of attention in recent years. So shame kind of comes in and out of public awareness as a topic. Brené Brown recently had a whole bunch of research on it that became super popular in the last 10 years or so, I think. But she is very far from the first shame researcher. John Bradshaw did a ton of incredible work in the field of shame, as did a plethora of psychologists before him. So this is not a new topic, but it is one that comes up over and over again because shame and guilt are two terms that are very commonly kind of mixed up psychologically when we talk about the negative emotion of having done something wrong. But they're actually two pretty different feelings, and I think it's really important to identify properly which one you're dealing with, because I think a lot of the time we use those terms interchangeably in situations where they actually shouldn't be used interchangeably. So here are some of the distinctions between those two terms, and I should note that these distinctions are not commonly agreed upon. Like, different theorists will talk about them in different ways. Some people say that you kind of can use these terms interchangeably. Other people will say not at all, you should look at them differently. I err a little bit more in that camp, and I'm going to explain why as we go through this video. Because I think that specifically if you're doing attachment healing work, those two terms are going to come up a lot, and the way that you deal with them and the way that you process and react to them is going to have to be a little bit different, because the way that they show up in the body and in the psyche are different and lead to different outcomes if they're dealt with unconsciously rather than mindfully and intentionally. So the kind of core, easy definition that I like to use when I think about the difference between shame and guilt is that guilt is the feeling of I made a mistake. I did something wrong, my behavior was wrong. Shame is the feeling of I am a mistake. Who I am as a human being, my very essence is flawed. There's something wrong with me. I shouldn't exist. That's kind of what's at the core of the feeling of shame. Versus guilt could, at the core of it, have the feeling I'm an okay person, I'm a good person, but I did something wrong, right? So it's not as extreme because it's not tied to your identity. Now, you can have a shame-based identity, so you can be a person who really does believe at their core that they're fundamentally flawed and there's something wrong with them. Every insecure attachment style, to a degree, has that belief about themselves. And you can also feel guilt, right? So those things can coexist. But guilt is more about your behavior, shame is more about your identity or sense of self. And the reason this is the case is because guilt is actually a slightly more complex feeling than shame. So to have guilt, you have to have an inherent understanding of the fact that other people are processing and believing and thinking things that are different from the way that you process and think about and believe things. And you have to notice the juxtaposition between what you did and the impact that it had on someone else. So you can do something perfectly well-meaning, it can have a negative impact on someone else, and you can feel guilt about that once you understand that person's perspective. Right? Versus with shame, it's actually an emotion that we experience a lot sooner in life. So shame, most psychologists believe we start feeling somewhere around 15 months. And our earliest experiences with shame is often a sense of disconnection. So a baby goes to its parent and tries to engage it in some way, and if the parent isn't available or isn't responsive or doesn't give the baby the warm response that the baby's looking for, the baby feels a sense of disconnection, of shame, and of feeling almost like their sense of self is disintegrating. And the reason it feels that way as a baby is because when you are that young, you don't actually have a very clear idea yet of the fact that you and your caregiver are separate people. Babies look at their caregivers as kind of an extension of themselves for a very long period of time. And during that period of time, if they are not mirrored by their caregiver, they experience that profound sense of shame as almost a part of their selfhood crumbling. And that's often why when we experience shame as adults, it truly feels like the words that people use very often are like a disintegrating feeling, like, oh, I want to sink into the ground and kind of let this terrible feeling just decompose me. It's actually very interesting how similar so many different people's account of the word shame is, and how many of them experience that same kind of somatic feeling of disintegration. So there's a book that I'm currently reading called Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame by Patricia DeYoung, and I'm probably going to make a whole video on it once I'm done it because it's a really good look into how attachment and shame end up fusing together. But basically what the author argues is that shame is the feeling of your sense of self disintegrating in the presence of a dysregulating other. And that starts to happen very young, and that's why from a very young age, babies can feel and experience shame. Guilt cannot be experienced until there's argument over it, but at least the age of 3, somewhere between 2 and 6, we start experiencing guilt. And I think that that kind of grows and grows because before the age of 6, you don't have much of a moral conscience. Like children below that age aren't really able yet, just developmentally, to think in terms of right and wrong. And to feel guilty, you have to be able to have some awareness of moral consciousness, right? Or at the least, and this is the argument for children being able to feel guilt quite a bit younger than 6 years, you have to have an idea that you are separate from other people and that you can do something that feels good to you but feels bad to someone else. It's a process called mentalizing that we develop continuously over the course of our lifetime, but that really starts coming online around the age of 4. And once you're able to mentalize, you're able to understand, I have a different mind than someone else, so what's acceptable to me is not necessarily acceptable to someone else. And it's not going to be a very sophisticated process at age 4, but it's going to be present enough that it's something the child can conceptualize of. So once we're able to do that, we're able to experience guilt because we're able to understand my actions that feel good for me didn't necessarily have a positive impact on someone else. So guilt is a more sophisticated emotion solely because it requires higher level thinking to access. Whereas shame is an earlier emotion, which means that our brain has been wiring itself around shame for a longer time than it's been wiring itself around guilt. So shame often feels kind of overwhelming and all-consuming in a way that guilt doesn't necessarily always feel. And the reason for that is because guilt is a little bit more complex. So there's a much more mental component active to feeling guilty, as opposed to shame, which can be purely instinctually, emotionally based when it comes up. So I've kind of already talked about it, but the second differentiation point between guilt and shame is that when you are feeling guilty, you are by definition considering someone else's perspective, versus when you feel shame, you're actually very preoccupied with your own perspective, even if it doesn't feel that way. So you might feel like you're thinking about what everyone else thinks of you, and you're thinking about judgments people might be making of you, but shame is actually a very kind of all-consuming, very internal experience where we often get kind of hijacked by the feeling of, I am a mistake, everything I've ever done is wrong, I shouldn't exist. And those thoughts are so huge and so overwhelming that it's actually very difficult to keep someone else's perspective in mind in a clean and true way when we're experiencing shame. We are very likely, when we're experiencing shame, to assume that everyone is looking at us with all of the judgment and all of the maliciousness with which we are looking at ourselves, and that's often not at all the case. But it gets us into a little bit of trouble when we think that we're feeling guilt, but actually what we're feeling is shame. Because, and this leads me to the third and last distinction that I'm going to draw on today, when we are experiencing shame, we feel the drive to disconnect and to isolate, versus when we are feeling guilt, we tend to feel the desire to reach out and make amends. And I think that many people, particularly those of us who are insecurely attached in some way, think that they are feeling guilty when actually they're feeling shame. And it can feel like when we are in shame, we are berating ourselves so heavily, we are so focused on the terrible things that we think about ourselves, that it might actually feel like we are absolving ourselves from the need to act and make amends, because it can feel like, okay, well, I've beat myself up so much, I've judged myself so much for this, that now I must kind of naturally be forgiven for the bad actions that I've taken, because I've put myself through psychological hell over it. But because shame is such an all-consuming emotion that is focused intensely on the self, it's actually very easy to forget when we're feeling shame that the pain we have caused other people does not go away by us hating ourselves. It only goes away by us showing up, acknowledging which actions we've taken, and making amends with that person. So I had an experience recently where I was discussing something with a friend that had happened a very long time ago that I had felt so much shame over for so long that I just never brought this thing up. I just kind of buried it in one of the drawers in my psyche and was like, I'm never gonna revisit that. And then it came up in conversation and I felt this like avalanche of shame. Like I was frozen, I could barely speak. My friend had to be like, ooh, breathe. I left the conversation and was like, oh my God, I did not know I had so much shame about that thing. And it occurred to me like 3 hours later, after like meditating on it, journaling a little bit about it, oh, I've been feeling shame over this thing for so many years because there's something I feel guilty about that I actually never acknowledged. And that feeling of my own hatred towards myself and how I handled the situation, and my embarrassment over how I handled the situation, actually was shrouding me from the very simple solution to reaching out to the person that I may have hurt all of those years ago and just apologizing. So that was what I ended up doing that night, and it was totally chill. They were like, it's water under the bridge, whatever, forget about it. But because I had buried the guilt of the experience under like layers and layers of shame, it became this much bigger thing in my head, right? And that's very often what happens when an emotion is shame-bound. So John Bradshaw talks about shame-bound emotions as feelings that we have shame around the very fact that we feel them. So depending on what your attachment style might be, or depending on myriad other factors related to how you were raised and what you came to view as acceptable versus not acceptable emotionally, you might feel shame around a variety of seemingly nonsensical emotions to feel shame around. So anytime you feel weak and vulnerable, you might automatically feel shame on top of that. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe anytime you feel proud and independent, automatically that feeling gets obscured by shame. Depending on what it was that we were encouraged to feel or not feel very early on in our lives, we can have patterns of certain emotions always being obscured by shame as soon as we feel them. And it's incredibly important to figure out which emotions those are for us, because those are the emotions where we're actually going to be blocked the most from feeling guilt around. Because remember, as soon as an emotion comes up and shame comes up to cover it, our instinctual response is to disappear, get out of there, and not feel that feeling at any costs. But in order to feel guilt about things that we've done or said in relation to other people, we have to be able to sit with those feelings for a while, right? So if this particular emotion that I had been feeling had not been a shame-bound one for me, I could have just sat down, looked at that situation all of those years ago, and gone, oh, I think I hurt this person, or I think I wasn't fair to this person. Let me go apologize and move on with my life. But because I had an emotion around that situation that was shame-bound, every time I thought of that situation, I just wanted to disappear, get out of that place in my head, go do something that was distracting. And so I was never able to actually sit down and look clearly at my own behavior and the impact that it had on other people. And this is something that almost everyone in some large or small form struggles with, but that we very rarely talk about. The fact that shame-bound emotions are actually the things that keep us from doing the right thing much of the time, because we believe that that form of self-punishment, because it's so overwhelming, is kind of a psychic means of making amends, when in reality, we might be completely and totally neglecting to look at the impact that a certain situation had on someone else, because we're so overwhelmed by the shame that comes up for us when we process it. And that's why understanding the difference between these two emotions, as well as understanding what they feel like in our body so we know which one it is that we're experiencing, is so important. Because guilt can actually be a very helpful self-monitoring process that helps us to understand where our behavior is and is not impacting others in a negative way, whereas shame is actually going to obscure our judgment a lot of the time and keep us from seeing that. And in any attachment healing journey, which is going to involve frequent obstacles, both personally and interpersonally, figuring out which one you're dealing with and what the appropriate response is, and or where you might have blind spots around a situation because it's being shrouded by shame, is incredibly important, because it helps you understand which actions need to be taken to repair relationships with other people when that's something you need to do. And sometimes guilt isn't even about repairing relationships with other people. You could have guilt over a situation where you think that you should not go and apologize to that other person, because maybe that would be opening up an old wound that would not be helpful. But you can use that self-awareness to understand why your actions were wrong and set some kind of internal boundary that can make you feel certain that in similar situations in the future, you're not going to behave in the same self or other destructive way, right? Okay, that is all that I have to say for today on the difference between guilt and shame. I probably will make a follow-up video on this, because shame in particular is such an all-consuming emotion that comes up so frequently in the attachment healing process. And it can be really difficult to manage our emotions around it when it does show up, so we need tools for that. And I'm going to work over the next little while to start developing my own tools for it. And I will let you guys know of anything I find along the way or anything I already have found in follow-up videos. So, of course, if you guys have tools for dealing with and managing shame internally, let us know in the comments. I love when you guys share what's working for you with each other, because that is how we all collectively get better. And until next time, I love you. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.